All right, I wanted to take a few minutes and go through some of these documents in Geary about the Mendicants. These help to illuminate this phenomenon of the 13th century, where these innovative churchmen were, of course, trying to create a new path of the religious life, specifically one that blended the pastoral care responsibilities and engagement with the world that the secular clergy did with the rigor and the intense devotion and study and things of a cloistered clergy, meaning the regular clergy, right? So these are both monks and secular clerics in a way, but really just a new thing that are collectively called mendicants, right? The first of these documents is the Rule of St. Francis of Assisi. Again, by rule, we mean a set of guidelines to govern a community, religious community. And Francis wrote out this rule. It's very simple. It is only, 12? There's only 12 sections of it, right? Compare this, for instance, to the Rule of St. Benedict, which is, vastly longer than this and a lot more detailed. Francis seems to have been perhaps more of a spirit of the law kind of person. It's like, well, teach people what they should do, and then they'll do it. We don't need a lot of rules and guidelines. But he does get into the essential features, certainly of the Franciscans, and perhaps some of the things that were common among all of the mendicants. And so one of the things that I noted in talking about Francis in the last video was that he never challenged the church authorities, and for this reason, his disarming personality, his way of life that he was suggesting was accepted, and he was allowed to form an order. Contrast this with Peter Waldo or Peter Valdez from about a half century before, actually not even, about a generation before, who had preached actively against the clergy because of their wealth and opulence, right? So from the very beginning here, in the very first section of the rule, Francis says, Brother Francis promises obedience and reverence to our Lord Pope Honorius and to his successors who canonically enter upon their office, and to the Roman Church. And the other brothers will obey Brother Francis and his successors, and so therefore, the order will always remain within the bounds of the church itself and will not challenge the authority of the Pope or criticize it for that matter, right? But at the same time, there is this radical new way of existing that Francis is, advocating for here. It's really not new. I mean, Jesus himself had said many things along these lines. But I firmly command all the brothers by no means to receive coin or money of themselves or through an intervening person. Right? So the absolute rejection of property of any kind, right? And going along with that, the brothers will be pilgrims and strangers in this world. In poverty and humility, serving God, they shall confidently go seeking for alms, right? And that's only to supply themselves with their daily sustenance. And so he is setting up a group of beggars here. This is why they're called the Friars Minor. They're essentially a group of beggar hermits who are doing good, serving others, helping others, to strengthen their faith in Christianity, or trying to convert others to this. Francis himself, in 1219, during what's called the Fifth Crusade, went to Egypt in an attempt to convert the Sultan, or he would have been very happy to die as a martyr. It seems he was granted an audience before the Sultan of Egypt. This would have been the Ayyubid Sultan, and he, according to the accounts, he preached to the Sultan. Muslim sources do not have any record of this, and so who knows? There's really no way to corroborate it. Bonaventure, who later followed and became the general, I can't remember the name of the leader of the Franciscan order, later in the 13th century, claimed that the Sultan was converted by Francis, but he remained a kind of closet or secret Christian, right? And so, pilgrims and strangers can mean going and doing missionary work in distant lands, but there are restrictions on that too, as we'll see in just a second here. The brothers may not preach in the bishopric of any bishop if they have been forbidden to by him. Again, they do not want to run afoul of the church itself or of any of the churchmen. Francis enjoyed the patronage of many churchmen in his era, and did really nothing to alienate any of them. Later, Franciscans would do that because what they were suggesting came with a kind of implicit criticism of the church, which itself had great wealth and great property. And here he counsels the brothers not to have, as he says, suspicious intercourse or take counsel with women. This is not a reference to sexual intercourse, by the way. It just means generally having a relationship with women, having conversations with women. And Francis himself did have female followers. The most notable of these is Clare of Assisi, who is in the next source, so I'll save that for a minute here. This is the section where it talks about, whoever the brothers by divine inspiration may wish to go among the Saracens and other infidels, like Francis himself did, shall seek permission to do so from their provincial ministers. But to none shall the ministers give permission to go, save those whom they shall see to be fit for the mission, right? So there needs to be some... the Franciscans might be fired with zeal like Francis was, but we've got to make sure they're doing this in wisdom, right? So this is probably to head off any possibility that the Franciscans might do radical things that will serve to undermine, the whole crusading enterprise and things like that. Clare of Assisi started her own parallel order. Really, this is along the Franciscan model, and she and Francis had been friends when they were young. She was very taken with his way of life and tried to follow him into this. But this really was not acceptable to any authorities in Christian medieval Europe at this point, to have women wandering around begging for alms. And preaching to people and, doing these sorts of things, right? The strictures placed on women in medieval Europe really show up in the way that the poor Clares, as they're called, were treated. They were allowed to form an order, but they were given, basically, by Pope Innocent III, the rule of St. Benedict to live by, right? So there was little to differentiate, despite their commitment to this life of poverty and simplicity that Francis was advocating for. There was little to differentiate them from any other nuns of any other order, right? And so Clare herself writes up an explanation of the fundamental principles of this order, right? And she notes here that Francis himself had given them the monastery of San Damiano, which is this, when Francis, initially had his conversion, the monastery of San Damiano was in ruin. There don't think there's anybody living there. And so he and his early followers went and began to rebuild this thing by themselves, really with their bare hands. And once that had progressed a certain way and they were accepted and allowed to form an order, he ended up bequeathing this or giving this to Clare and to the sisters who were following her. And so Clare talks about this, right? And says, well, Francis himself said, "Come and help me in building the monastery of San Damiano. For here will dwell ladies whose good name and holy life will glorify our Heavenly Father through his holy church." And so she makes it sound like Francis had intended this from the beginning, that he was undertaking this on behalf of these women who would follow him. And there seems to be some basis for that, right? She talks in here a great deal about holy poverty, right? We have bound ourselves again and again to Our Lady, most holy poverty. It's not like monks and nuns didn't prize poverty as a virtue, but the Clares were, to some extent, forbidden from pursuing exactly the kind of life that they wanted to pursue, right? One of the things they did a great deal is the Clares were noted for their devotion to the Virgin Mary, probably because she was such a great symbol for the kind of life they were trying to live. And so there's a good deal in here about that devotion. She does say here, and this is an interesting compromise given what they were, what they were allowed to do in pursuing the religious life, right? She says, sisters must be careful and ever careful and prudent, not to acquire or receive more land around such a place, meaning around a monastery, around a convent, than strict necessity demands for a garden wherein to grow vegetables, right? And so, Francis's ideal is we would reject all property except, and this is where the Franciscan order itself faces a conundrum. It's like, if you're going to have a friary, and the friary is going to have land and buildings and things like this, right? To whom does that belong? And Francis would say, probably, well, it's the church's, they're just letting us use it. It is not ours. And the other Franciscans begin to use this. Eventually, there's a kind of theological compromise. Really, it's more semantics and hair splitting than anything else, right? But they say, well, you have the use of this. You do not own it. But some were not even satisfied with that. And this is one of the reasons why the order itself split. We can see Clare here struggling with this issue, right? Well, we have this property which is part of the convent, but we need to be careful not to receive too much property. And normally grants and gifts to monasteries were given in the form of land. And so she's saying we should reject land around these things except what we need to grow a garden, to feed ourselves. Okay, let's turn to the Dominicans for a few minutes here. This set of documents demonstrates a number of things. So this is, these documents are all part of the canonization process of St. Dominic. He died in 1221. Testimonies were gathered about his life and about his death, and even about events that happened after his death that were associated with his body and his tomb. And all of this hints that, or is evidence that, the process for creating saints was becoming, or perhaps had become by this point, standardized. Little side note here, this is actually a set of documents that I wrote a paper on when I was in a class on medieval Europe as an undergrad. Actually was assigned an early edition of the Geary Source Reader. And I wrote a paper on this, and eventually this was one of my earliest publications in a student journal. And so there's a lot here to chew on, right, in this set of documents. You can learn a great deal about canonization, about the Dominicans and what they were about. And so one of the things you see here that's pretty obvious is that there are miracles associated with the body of St. Dominic, right, with his remains. And that had become, by this point, the standard by which the sufficient holiness to be canonized as a saint was determined. And, the base requirements would eventually become that there have to be 3 miracles. These miracles have to be verified by witnesses, and the witnesses cannot disagree with each other in, at least the most important details. And so this whole process of figuring out, who is worthy to become a saint, you can really see that in operation here. There are commonalities among all of these testimonies, and they all say basically the same thing. It's probably because they knew that they had to say those things in order for Dominic to be granted sainthood. But at the same time, all of these testimonies are from Dominican brothers who knew Dominic personally, had experienced him in his life, and many of them were present when during the translation of his remains, meaning when they opened his tomb and took out his coffin and moved it to another place, a more suitable burial spot. And they all testify to we smelled a wonderful smell when they opened this. And that, of course, would have been an incredible miracle that the body wasn't decomposing and rotting and stinking up the place. And so this is, that itself would constitute a miracle. There's also mention in here of healing miracles at the tomb of St. Dominic. And so the miracles are super important. But saints were also expected to live holy lives, right? And so some of that shows up, a good deal of that shows up in their recollections about Dominic. So, for instance, this one, when he came to any place where there were any religious houses, he visited them all, preaching and encouraging them to regular observance. And this is not just Dominican houses, right? One of the things that it's kind of obvious about the mendicants is they're not exclusive, at least not early on. They're trying to figure things out. They're encouraging each other, and that remains an ideal for some. Though the Franciscans and Dominicans, by the end of the 13th century, were involved in some pretty serious disagreements. Dante in the Paradiso has Francis and Dominic actually praising each other, probably because Dante was concerned about the division between these two great mendicant orders and was trying to encourage his readers to, transcend those differences that they had come up with. And, in these early documents, there seems to be a more, what we might call ecumenical spirit between the different orders. Here's the fragrance at the tomb, right? That one's a pretty constant in all of these. This is one of the early companions of Dominic, right, where he, this is pretty typical of a Dominican. It starts with studying theology. The Dominicans prized scholarship and preaching, and then going to convert unbelievers. This, of course, one of their first assignments was to go and preach to the Cathars, as we've said. More stuff about his tomb and all of that here. Okay, so this is one that I found interesting. It seems that Dominic would not wear shoes when he was traveling places. When he came into a town, he would put his shoes on because it was the respectable thing to do, but then he took shoes off when he was traveling in the countryside and made a point to walk over sharp rocks, right? This is suffering, penitential suffering, we might call it. And at one point he feels really sorrowful, and his companion asks him why, and he's like, well, the stones were so sharp that I just had to put my shoes on, and I feel really bad about that, right? Even then, there's even this, right? When he came to the rivers that were swollen because of the heavy rain, he beat them down with the sign of the cross and went over, encouraging his nervous companions to cross too. And so, is that a miracle? Is it just an interesting recollection? It's kind of hard to say exactly what the point of that is, right? I mean, this guy seems to have the ability to calm the storms and such things, much like Jesus was reputed to have that ability. Here is more information about, the Dominicans preaching to the Cathars, this in places like Toulouse and Albi. And it even mentions that Dominic was a friend of Jews and pagans. By pagans, they really mean Muslims. That's what that would stand for. There were many of these in Spain. Of course, there are many Muslims in Spain, right? And in fact, by everybody except for the heretics and the enemies of the church. And so, Dominic seems to have had friend. Now, I will say later on that the fiercest critics of Jews in Europe, at least by the 14th century or so, maybe even late 13th century, were Dominicans. There are some, Dominican preachers who were actively trying to force the Jews to convert or have them expelled from territories and things. Okay, and then the last, there's more to these canonization documents, but I don't want to belabor the point. The last of these is Thomas of Cantipré. I did mention his name in the last video, I believe, and I had him conflated. There are three figures named Thomas. There are more. Of course, you got Thomas Aquinas, who is not even in this number that I'm mentioning. But there's three who have very similar names. Thomas of Celano was a biographer of Francis, and then Thomas of Cantipré was a Dominican. I had mentioned that he was part of the Devotio Moderna last time. I was thinking of Thomas of Kempis, actually, who wrote on the Imitation of Christ. So sorry for conflating those. But Thomas of Cantipré was a convert to the Dominican order. He actually started out as a canon regular, or an Augustinian canon, living by the Augustinian rule. Okay. Here he gives a defense of the mendicants. Now, this is somewhat later. This is like a generation or so after Francis and Dominic had died. And they both died in the 1220s. And so he's writing this, 40, 50 years after that, and really trying to defend the mendicants because by this point, some of them were seen as a potential threat or a problem even within the church, right? And so he he mentions, and I think that this is an important point, the friars, both the preachers and the minors, meaning the Dominicans and the Franciscans, in accordance with the requirements of their orders, seem to follow all three ways of life one and the same time. That's three types of clergy. In other words, they study with the clerics. That's the, this would be like the schoolmasters, the standard clerics. They devote themselves to the divine office with the canons, and in common with the monks and other religious, they practice community life with its accusations and beatings and fasting. This isn't the exact breakdown that everyone would have given for the main responsibilities of these different forms of the religious life, but Thomas of Cantipré is really trying to emphasize that the mendicants bring together all of the best parts of living the Christian religious life, right? And apart from all that, they have chosen to live without owning any properties at all. Let's remember that one of the inspirations, it seems, for the creation of the mendicant orders was this concern over the corrosive effects of commercialism, of wealth, of the growth of mercantile enterprise in this period. And he notes here that he feels constrained to reply to the critics of these orders. Many of the critics were concerned that there was too much criticism coming from the friars of the wealth of the church and perhaps the wealth of nobility, and very few people who lived in wealth and luxury probably wanted to reject all of that and take up this life, and most of them perhaps still felt like they could be good Christians without doing that. So there's more again to this, right? There's some stuff about Marian devotion here, and his defense of the sincerity of their religious life. So take a look at these things and try to identify the major inspirations behind these orders. And this is something you can write a short paper on if you choose to do so. Thanks.